Welcome everyone to another poetry recording. This is Anthem for Doomed Youth by Wilfred Owen. Before we can go any further, we need to look at the background of the author. It gives us a better understanding as to why he would put the piece together. After school, he worked as an assistant teacher. In 1915, the year after the First World War broke out, he volunteered to fight in the English army. He was short, weak, and often ill, but by that stage, the army was not fussy about who joined. In 1916, he was sent to the front line in Belgium. That's where soldiers fought in deep trenches or ditches against the German army. The next year, he was trapped by enemy fire with 18 other soldiers in a collapsing trench for 4 days. He described the experience, saying, "Each of us 3/4 dead, all shaking uncontrollably and vomiting." He was sent home from suffering from shell shock or PTSD. He began writing poetry at the institution where he was sent. 5 of his poems were published, but were not noticed. The next year, he was sent to the front line again. He was killed by the German gunfire on a canal as he was trying to anchor a bridge. He was awarded a medal for bravery after his death. His parents received the telegram informing them of his death on the day the war ended. What passing bells for these who die as cattle? Only the monstrous anger of the guns. Only the stuttering rifles' rapid rattle can patter out their hasty orisons. No mockeries now for them, no prayers, nor bells, nor any voice of mourning save the choirs. The shrill, demented choirs of wailing shells, and Bugles calling for them from sad shires. What candles may be held to speed them all? Not in the hands of boys, but in their eyes shall shine the holy glimmers of goodbyes. The pallor of girls' brows shall be their pall, their flowers the tenderness of patient minds, and each slow dusk a drawing down of blinds. If we just look at the vocabulary for a second, passing bells, a custom in England dating back many centuries, was to ring a bell when a person was dying. Those who heard it were to pray that the person's soul would pass to the light of heaven when he or she died. Hence the term passing bell. Today, churches traditionally toll bells at funerals. If we look at the term cattle, this is the comparison of soldiers to slaughtered cattle underscores the inhumanity of war. It treats men as mere animals. Orisons, those are prayers. Wailing shells. It is ironic that the killers, or the shells, are also personified mourners. If we look at the word candles, these were held by altar boys. The candles represent to Owen ritualistic, artificial funeral trappings. More appropriate to him is the sad glimmer in the eyes of these boys. The word pall refers to the cloth covering the coffin at a funeral. To Owen, it is like the candles and artificial funeral trapping, more appropriate as a pall is to the pallor or the paleness on the faces of girls. And lastly, drawing down of blinds. This simple phrase allows the reader to picture the behind-the-scenes suffering of the loved ones after the burial of a soldier. So a little summary of the poem. Anthem for Doomed Youth was written by a soldier, Wilfred Owen, who died in the last week of the Great War. His poem clearly communicates the sorrow and the horror he experienced during that war. In the poem, the noise of battle gives way to silent grief. Young men who should have lived died in the chaos of battle. Those who lost loved ones were not present at the deaths or burials of their young men. In the place of the usual funeral rites, sounds of battle, distant grief, and nature's close of day were what they had to mark their deaths. Throughout the poem, Owen employed imagery to bring to life the sorrow and the horror of war. By describing the sounds and sights, by comparing a fitting funeral to the reality of death in war, and by questioning the sufficiency of religion to provide solace in the face of brutality. Let us look at the structure of the poem. Anthem for Doomed Youth is an Italian or Petrarchan sonnet. A Petrarchan sonnet consists of an 8-line stanza called an octave and a 6-line stanza called a sestet. Generally, the first stanza represents the theme and the second stanza develops it. The octave covers the brutality of the war. It's dominated by the sound of battle. And the sestet is a requiem for the dead. It's characterized by muted grief. In order to expose the horror and the tragedy of death on the battlefield, the poet has created a parody of a civilian battlefield. Anthem for Doomed Youth is a hybrid sonnet. That is, it combines the structure of a Petrarchan sonnet with the rhyme scheme of a Shakespearean sonnet, except for the lines 11 and 12. The rhyme scheme of Shakespeare's sonnets is A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. The extended metaphor emphasizes the difference between death in peacetime and death on the battlefield. So we'll look at the structure of the poem further. The first 8 lines is the octave. It covers the brutality of war. We hear war sounds from the rifles and the guns. There is no proper funeral for the soldiers that die on the battlefield. Following that is the sestet, the last 6 lines of the poem, indicating to us how people at home deal with loss and the futility of life. An Italian Petrarchan sonnet. The rhyme scheme is usually A, B, B, A, A, B, B, A, C, D, E, C, D, E, or C, D, C, C, D, C. The sestet can have different variations. The first 8 lines are the octave, in which a poem or situation is presented. There is a volta, as discussed above, either near the end of the octave or the beginning of the sestet. In the sestet, or the last 6 lines, the problem is then resolved. Anthem means a hymn of praise. Doomed, we know, means that something is definitely going to die or have a very little chance of survival. Here we remember that the poet wrote about his time during World War I as a soldier on the battlefield. Youth is not usually associated with death. So, to conclude, we pick up that the title is ironic. As we've said, Anthem is a joyous song of celebration, but when coupled with doomed youth, it implies sorrow and is a woeful expression of young people without hope. What passing bells for these who die as cattle? People are dying, and our speaker asks us, what sound is there to mark their deaths? Those passing bells, they're church bells, which are rung to mark someone's death when they've passed away. Already, this phrase has introduced religious imagery to the poem, but it's contrasted with the horrific experience of the front lines of war, where men die like cattle and where we can't imagine any church bells are ringing. Did you notice that our speaker says these instead of those? Those gives a sense of distance to the poem. You might use the word to talk about people who are far away or whom you feel separated from. If you use these, it's as though you're talking about someone who's right here in the room with you. The word choice of our speaker has deliberately brought the soldiers much closer to us as the readers. It is as if we're on the battlefield with them, seeing those soldiers falling right and left. And what are these soldiers compared to? Cattle. It's not exactly the nicest simile we've ever heard, but it does pack a big punch. The phrase die as cattle suggests slaughter. He is saying that something about these deaths is especially terrible. It's inhumane. It's treating soldiers like animals. It seems like these men are dying in multitudes. All in all, we've got a pretty bleak start to what will probably be a pretty bleak poem. Only the monstrous anger of the guns. It's nice of our speaker to answer his own question for us. The only thing that marks their deaths is the angry sound of more guns. Gunfire is just about the opposite of pleasant church bells. The word monstrous is a pretty big and heavy word, especially to load on top of anger. It portrays the anger of the war. Anger is already a pretty violent and scary thing. So monstrous anger means that something about these guns is terrible enough to put regular anger to shame. Anger of the guns. This is a personification. The sound of guns contrasts the sound of ringing bells. We could also say that it reflects the feelings of the soldiers. Only the stuttering rifle's rapid rattle can patter out their hasty orisons. Our speaker says that the rifle fire is the only kind of prayer for the dying soldiers. Orison is a fancy word for prayer. There's an anaphora present with the word only in line 2 and 3. If you need it further explained, please kindly go to the previous video on poetry terminology. The word hasty makes us aware of the suddenness of death on the war front and also underscores the haphazard and senseless nature of the killing that's going on there. These are not thoughtful deaths. They're quick, loud, and messy. The word stuttering helps bridge the gap between the rifles and the people back home who are saying prayers for these boys. By personifying the rifles, it gives us a weird opposite of what happened when the soldiers were first compared to cattle. The soldiers become like animals while the guns become like people. That does not sound like a good combination. It's also important to note that there is personification with the word stuttering. So we see the guns are personified again. There's also alliteration with the T's in stuttering and the R's in rifles, rapid rattle. The alliteration of the R and the T imitate the sound of gunfire. At the end of rattle, we get enjambment. This speeds up the tempo, which captures the intensity of the battlefield as well as the speed at which the shots are fired. Orisons, as we've said, are prayers. Gunfire replaces prayers, normally on one's deathbed or at a funeral. There is no time for prayer on the battlefield when someone dies. In fact, it is uttered quite hastily. Hasty also indicates the sadness of death. The alliteration and the onomatopoeia indicate the sound of guns. It's harsh, it's forceful, and it's repetitive. No mockeries for them from prayers or bells. There are no prayers and no bells on the front to mock the dying men. This line strips the holy solemn mask off those rituals and casts them as an outright sham. No mockeries now for them. No prayers, no bells. These words, the no, and the nor, reinforce the idea that the only thing they will hear are the sounds of bombs, and this strengthens the tone of the anger of the guns. The speaker feels this way because he thinks that those rituals totally miss the point. They ignore what's really happening. They glorify the deaths by pretending that the fighting is purposeful and noble, when really it's akin to slaughtering cattle. Prayers and bells are traditional rites. Their dying moments are empty as they are utterly alone in death. So we see here that the poet believes that there is no need for traditional funerals for soldiers because their deaths are so meaningless that conventional prayers, bells, and choirs would literally be a mockery. Nor any voice of mourning save the choirs. Let's first look at the dash. This dash is used to further explain what the poet means by choirs. It creates a pause which allows the reader to imagine the sound and to emphasize the point that it isn't the usual church choir one would expect. It reinforces the irony that the only choirs the soldiers have are the shrill whine of shells. There's basically no mourning going on whatsoever on the battlefield, except for the wailing of shells, which our speaker compares to the sound of choirs. Once again, we've got a traditionally religious image, that being of choirs, being used as a metaphor for the rather unlovely reality of war. In this case, the sound of shelling. The contrast is quite terrifying. This is not a choir you want singing at your funeral or even your average Sunday Mass. The use of these uncharacteristic adjectives could be another way for our speaker to point out the huge difference between what life and death are really like on the battlefield and the holy and noble way that those back home present it. Plus, the word choice also has a way of pointing out that all the holy and patriotic civilians are absent on the front. There's no voice of mourning there for the young men. The shrill, demented choirs of wailing shells. This is a freaky sort of choir. It's shrill and demented. Something is twisted here. This is not a choir you want singing at your normal funeral. The use of these uncharacteristic adjectives could be another way for our speaker to point out the huge difference between what life and death are really like on the battlefield and the holy and noble way that those back home present it. This word choice has a way of pointing out that all the holy and patriotic civilians are absent. There's no voice of mourning there for the young men, just the sound of shells. Our speaker is either lamenting this fact, wondering where all these mournful patriots are in actual battle, or he's saying that if there isn't any fancy memorial going on the battlefield, then we shouldn't pretend by having them at home. Shrill is a high-pitched sound. It has a connotation of something very uncomfortable and unpleasant. Demented is a horrific sound on the battlefield. Wailing shells. Wailing means to cry out in pain. From grief or anger, it is also high-pitched. This is a personification, and it's quite ironic that the killers or the bombs are also personified as mourners. The chaos of the cannons and guns replaces the usual choir at civilian funerals. The futility of warfare is insane and something that drives soldiers mad. And Bugles calling for them from sad shires. Bugles is a small trumpet used to mark time of day in barracks, also sounded in battle to retreat. It makes a reference to calling up even more doomed youth or doomed men to war. It's usually also sounded at funerals of the soldiers. So we see the personification here happening for Bugles calling. The musical instruments used to play the last post at the military are given human attributes of being able to call out. Our speaker now draws our attention to the sound of mourning for the soldier, the sound of Bugles playing in sad towns. Makes reference to places the soldiers come from. Emotions are so overwhelming that it seems as if the whole country is grieving. There is a lot of sad music in this short poem, although the music of these Bugles is a bit more literal than those scary sounding choirs. There's no metaphor here. That Bugle music is all too real, as it does represent death. The tone, in contrast with the rest of the octave, there is a gentleness and regret. It is slow and quiet, as the last line of the octave prepares us for a more subdued tone in the sestet. As we've picked up in the octave, that war is being humanized through personification of armament. War seems a living being, much more than the soldiers or people mourning their death. Line 1 to 7 had the tone of aggression, while line 8 contrasts it with gentleness and regret. Line 9. What candles may be held to speed them all? Candles here are a symbol of hope and respect. Now our speaker wants to know what candles all these mourners can hold in honor of these fallen soldiers. We might think of this as a more general question, as if to ask, what rituals can people possibly perform to help these soldiers pass on peacefully, or to speed them all? Rituals like lighting candles in churches. Candles were usually held by the altar boys in the church. At a funeral, a candle is a sign of hope and of an afterlife. It's a symbolic farewell to the dead. So we could think of these candles as a metaphor for the larger ceremonies we hold when attempting to honor those killed in action. Given what the poem has shown us so far, we're pretty sure that there isn't some special scented candle that we'll find lit back home that will help the soldier in any real way. We can also expect, since he did it in the first stanza, that our speaker might be about to answer his own question. The sestet will develop the idea of comparing a right and fitting funeral to a death in war. There are no ceremonies, there are no traditional rites, and we could say that there's no dignity. Not in the hands of boys, but in their eyes shall shine the holy glimmers of goodbyes. Candles are compared to small glimmers of light in the eyes of the soldiers. The speaker answers the question on what candles will be held, and we see here that there will be no candles held, but just the little light or the glimmers that shine in the eyes of the soldiers on the battlefield. Our speaker brushes off the idea of lighting candles. What's the point of that? He instead turns our attention to tears. That's the holy glimmers, which, if you think about it, are also a sort of ritual that marks the soldiers' death, probably more sincere than candles. This reference to what's in their eyes could refer both to the tears of the soldiers' sons and to the tears of the soldiers themselves. Holy glimmers and goodbyes certainly sound more lofty and noble than tears and death, but when you think about it, we're still talking about human pain and suffering. There are no candles to send them to the afterlife. There are tears only, which are more sincere. Holy is associated with God and prayer, unlike the slaughter of war. The pallor of girls' brows shall be their pall. The pale, drained faces of girls will stand in for the cover on the dead soldier's coffin. A pall is a cloth typically draped over a coffin. So in this case, the girls' pale faces or shocked faces will be metaphorically draped over the soldiers' coffins, sending them off in style. Girls here represent the women or the young girls and the daughters that are left behind. This line, like the lines before it, brings our attention to the suffering caused by the death of the soldiers, not only to the soldiers, but also their towns and families. And it's mixing that suffering in it with the language of funeral rituals. So what matters here is not the pall, but the pallor. The girl's grief is what really counts. Our speaker is not letting the funeral ritual get away with seeming somber and noble. He's forcing it to take on the weight of the real suffering that surrounds it. These soldiers will have no cloths over their coffins, no proper burial. However, the girls will be a reminder of the extreme youth of those in war. They are flowers, the tenderness of patient minds. Flowers here represent a tribute to the dead, a mark of respect. There are no flowers for the men, like a normal funeral. We see a metaphor come about here. Thoughts of the grieving loved ones are compared to the flowers at the funeral. In the place of flowers, there will be people thinking about them, having tender, loving memories of them. This is one of the more mysterious lines in the poem. It could be that our speaker is holding up tender, patient minds in contrast to those who are all eager and excited about war. This line could be telling us that the only positive tribute to the dead soldiers comes from the tender thoughts and concerns of those who have more patient, sensitive minds. Those who are really concerned about their safety and the danger they're in and mourn their losses. On the other hand, it could be that this line's getting at something more critical of those patient minds. Patient minds. They are lost memories. Patient minds could be looking back at their lost, tender, loving memories. And each slow dusk, a drawing down of blinds. Our speaker ends with an image of blinds being drawn shortly before dark. The word slow reflects the way the poem has been slowing down throughout the second stanza, with this last line being the slowest and the quietest of them all. All that pacing is enhanced by the fact that this line, unlike many of the ones that have come before, is written in perfect iambic pentameter. The drawing of blinds certainly works on one hand as an image of death. The families that have lost young men are the ones closing the blinds as a sort of matching image to the closing and ending of life. It also works as an image of civilians at home, with the drawing down of blinds acting as a symbol for the way they're keeping out the realities of the war. They don't want to be troubled by it. The grammar of the sentence also has a brilliant way of demonstrating the way that people are unwilling to take responsibility for what's going on. It's a passive sentence, which makes it seem like the blinds are drawing themselves down. Nobody's in charge here. Nobody's taking any responsibility. Each slow dusk, every day more and more soldiers die. There seems to be a continuation of the death with the word each. The alliteration of the D slows down the rhythm. It adds a stillness and a despair in the tone of this line. Drawing down of blinds. The setting sun is metaphorically compared to another tradition of blinds being drawn in respect and acknowledgement of those who have passed on. There are no such marks of respect on the battlefield, only the natural fading of the sun. This creates a mood of grieving and pain. Those left behind are reluctant to accept death of the loved ones lost on the battlefield. There's a double metaphor here of dusk, which is the drawing of the curtains on a passing day, as well as death, which draws the curtains on life. Traditionally, blinds were drawn when someone died as a sign to the world to mark their respect. All the references mentioned in the stanza, that being candles, holy glimmers of goodbyes, Paul, flowers, patient minds, drawing of blinds, are all references to the rituals performed as payment of lost respect to someone who passed on, which are not there on the battlefield, and which is a stark contrast to the horrible and the inhumane ways these soldiers died. These symbols of hope, respect, force us to face the real suffering that surrounds the soldiers' death instead of following funeral rituals to let their death seem honorable. The poet perhaps feels the church could have done more to prevent or stop the war. Instead of blinds being drawn around a dead person, the dead soldiers on the battlefield will only have the day to draw to a close. Dusk would naturally darken the place where they lay. It is as if nature itself is also drawing the blind and mourning the young men's deaths. As we look at the themes of the poem, the horror of war and the terrible conditions facing soldiers even after they have died, the futility, meaningless, and inadequacy of religion in response to such horror as seen during war. The tone of the poem. The poem begins in a mood of bitterness and irony, but as the focus shifts from the battlefield to the home front, from the immediate setting of mechanized warfare to the distant and calm civilian life, the mood shifts towards sadness and regret. These are the comparisons of the rites offered to people at their funerals compared to the rites they received on the battlefield. For example, a traditional funeral would have church bells announcing a death, while on the battlefield there was gunfire. Traditional funeral would have prayers for the deceased. However, on the battlefield, the only prayer available was the rapid rifle fire. There would be choirs, candles, velvet cloths, flowers, and drawing down of blinds out of respect for the mourning at a traditional or religious ceremony. However, on the battlefield, the soldiers only received demented choirs of wailing gun shells, pale and mourning faces of young girls, kind, mournful thoughts of loved ones, and each slow dusk falling on the battlefield. Thank you very much for tuning in. I hope that this poem becomes helpful. Please remember to like, share, comment, press the notification button, as well as subscribe for more content to assist you through your grade 11 year and grade 12 year. Thank you for watching.